Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the State Department. I'm a little off. John's going to be disappointed in me. That's okay. Just a couple things to mention at the top. First of all, we appreciate the United Kingdom's leadership in announcing today that it will continue to meet the Wales Summit Defense Investment Pledge. Now, for all of you who are not NATO NICs around here, that means basically reaching targets of overall defense spending of 2% of GDP and investment in new capabilities that's 20% of their defense budget. So we applaud their leadership. We strongly urge all NATO allies to do the same, and it's critically important that NATO be able to respond effectively to existing and future threats. And the only way to do that is for allies to make the necessary investment in their armed forces. As one of our greatest friends and our strongest allies, the United Kingdom is our indispensable partner in all ongoing NATO activities, including reassurance measures and also resolute support mission in Afghanistan. So again, thank you to the UK. Also, briefly wanted to mention today, the United States and the United Arab Emirates launched the Sawab Center, which is a joint online messaging and engagement initiative that was first announced by President Obama earlier this year at the White House Summit on countering violent extremism, which took place, or at least a couple of days here at the State Department. U.S. Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, Richard Stengel, as well as the UAE's Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, Dr. Anwar Gargash, attended the launch. Now, the Sawab Center will use direct online engagement to rapidly and effectively counter terrorist propaganda, including messages used to recruit foreign fighters, fundraise for illicit activities, and intimidate and terrorize local populations. It's intended to contribute to the online debate by giving a platform to moderate and tolerant voices from across the region and amplifying inclusive and constructive narratives. As President Obama stated earlier this week, in order to defeat terrorists like ISIL, it will require the international community to discredit their ideology. And this is one of the key lines of effort in the overall campaign against ISIL. So the United States will therefore continue to do its part to support partners like the United Arab Emirates to counter ISIL's hateful ideology, and will partner specifically with Muslim communities as they work to reject some of these distorted interpretations of Islam that are propagated and peddled by ISIL. That's all I have at the top. Leslie?
Yeah. I know probably a few people want to ask about these cyber attacks, but the White House and the Homeland spoke about that earlier. I just want to very briefly ask, do you have anything to add to what they said? Is there any links to the State Department's own outage recently?
Again, not that we're aware of. I can say that Secretary Kerry was briefed on this, obviously, in Vienna. As for our own systems, we have no outages for the department that have been reported today. Obviously, the department continuously monitors our computer systems for any outages. That's on a 24/7 basis, but they continue to operate normally. So nothing to report from this end, but we'll continue to watch it closely.
Okay.
Yep.
And then back on track on something else. I wanted to raise with you the Taliban and the Afghan peace talks that took place in which the US and China were observers. Is there anything from these discussions that give you hope that a formal peace process can be launched, and what makes this discussion different?
Well, as we've long said, we believe an Afghan-led and an Afghan-owned peace effort and reconciliation process is really the best and surest way to end the violence and ensure a lasting stability in Afghanistan and the region. So we certainly commend the government of Afghanistan for initiating this reconciliation process with the Taliban, and we strongly support the government's efforts and prioritization of peace and reconciliation. And that said, we also, Pakistan has also been involved in these, and we certainly appreciate its efforts and involvement in this as well. It's an important, obviously, important partner.
Is there anything, I mean, as those talks have took place, there were continued attacks in Afghanistan, in Kabul. Is there anything that you think that you'd like to see to come that would come out of this process quickly?
Well, obviously, you know, an end to the violence, ongoing violence, is obviously a priority in any situation, but certainly in this case. And you know, as we have always said again about the armed opposition groups that take part in these talks, you know, we want to see as part of any outcome a renouncement of violence. You know, we want to see them break any associations with international terrorism, and we also want to see them accept the Afghan constitution, including its protections for women and minorities. So those are the outcomes we've long said we wanted to see. But in general, you know, this is a positive step, a step in the right direction. These peace talks.
Thanks.
Yeah, sure.
Can you go to Iran talks?
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure.
Do you know who represented the U.S. Delegation?
You know what? I think it was some individuals from our mission in Kabul. I don't believe I have exactly who was there in an observer status, I believe. So, but I don't have the exact individual's name or position.
And do the U.S. have any role in bringing these parties together?
Well, you know, look, I mean, it's obviously something as I said, we've long supported. And something we've obviously, you know, in our discussions frequently with the Afghanistan government have raised and we encouraged, but I'll leave it at that. Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, sorry for being late.
No worries, you weren't that
missing
late.
at the top. You know,
I didn't. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to ask about the Iran talks. Now, there are reports that there are more briefings than you would expect, and that is really a bad sign in many ways. Some people are saying, could you comment on that? Is that true? I mean, you know, I'm following our colleagues here and so on.
Sorry, just to clarify, you said more briefings.
The more briefings
the
there are
or?
by all sides.
Okay.
You know,
so you're saying more engagement with the media spells...
more engagement with the media, according to these reports, you know, spells out sort of, you know, very difficult situation.
I frankly don't have overall a lot to say about the talks other than that, you know, they're obviously ongoing. Secretary Kerry, his team remain there.
Right.
The Iranians remain there. I think the Russian and Chinese foreign ministers left to attend a BRICS summit. You know, but they remain hard at work on the ground in Vienna. I'm not going to gauge the number of briefings as a barometer for how well the talks are going. Obviously, difficult issues, as we discussed yesterday and the day before, remain. They're trying to surmount those issues and work towards a comprehensive agreement, but we're not there yet.
So let me ask you, from your experience and from your conversations with those your
Sure.
colleagues in Vienna and so on. Now, do we have like one issue that is a problem, a number of issues that are a problem, any particular issue, or there's a whole gamut of things that need to be renegotiated, so to speak?
Well, good question, but not a question I'm going to answer in any depth or detail from here, because you know, these are all issues that are being discussed right now in the negotiating room, and as we've often said about many different negotiations, we don't want to do that from here, from the podium in public. We want to let our team, the Iranians, the P5+1 other parties there on the ground negotiate these details. But you know, you've gotten, you know, as you said, from some of the briefings on the ground, you've gotten a sense of some of the issues that remain that need to be worked through. You know, fundamentally, again, we've said, the President said, the Secretary said multiple times, we would rather walk away than not get the best agreement we possibly can that prohibits a nuclear weapon or Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon.
And my last question, and instead of setting, was it wrong to set deadlines? Perhaps they should have set some target dates or something like this that would give you more flexibility, because with every passing deadline, the deadline element seems to lose its, you know, its essence or its importance. So what happens, let's say, if they miss this deadline? Will we have another target date, or what will go? I mean, what is likely to happen?
Well, I don't want to get too far out ahead of ongoing negotiations and talk about additional deadlines or what might happen next. Not really for me to speak to at this point. We're still intent on trying to reach a deal over the next 20 or 48 hours, and that's where the focus remains. From that point, we'll assess what additional steps need to be taken. We've talked a lot about deadlines. They're motivational factors and can help drive the negotiations forward. But what we've said throughout is, if we need to negotiate further, we will. The goal here is a good deal, not meeting some deadline.
And I promise this is my final
sure thing.
question on this issue. Now, if it doesn't happen on Friday, the 10th, Congress gets an additional 30 days. Could you explain that? I mean, instead of just 30-day in which they review and have, whatever input and so on, they have like a larger period of time, maybe 60 days and so on. Could you explain that to us?
Well, I mean, just as you rightly note that I believe it's the 10th, that Congress would then, yes, get an additional 60-day review period.
Okay.
But again, as we've said before, if we reach a deal, which we're all striving towards, we expect it to stand up to and pass congressional scrutiny, regardless of the length of any review period. So, that's not, again, our focus. Our focus is getting the best possible deal.
Thank you.
Yeah, please, go ahead, Liz.
Mark, can you confirm that the Iranians have made a new proposal?
I cannot, no, not for me. Please, yeah.
Can we go to Colombia?
Sure.
I wanted to ask you about the FARC. They announced today a unilateral ceasefire from the 20th of July on. Do you welcome this step? Is this positive in the peace talks?
Well, I think, without having seen those reports myself, we all obviously would welcome any kind of sincere and credible ceasefire and cessation of violence. But I'll leave it at that and see if we have anything additional to say later. Please.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Mark, what can you tell us about Ambassador Kennedy's role in the releasing of the former Toyota executive, Julie Hamp, who was released from jail today?
I'm sorry, you're talking about Ambassador Kennedy,
In Japan, yes.
In Japan, of course.
Caroline Kennedy's involvement in getting this former executive released from jail today.
Well, I don't have any comment, frankly. I don't know what, if any, role she played. So
it's been reported in several newspapers and such, and wire reports that she did have some involvement. Can you take the question?
Again, I'm sure she was engaged at some level, but in terms of concretely what role she played, I'll see if we have anything to
add to
that. Please, yeah, go ahead. Saeed.
I want to go to a new topic.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Today or yesterday marks the one-year anniversary of the Gaza war. And I have a couple of questions on that. First of all, Israeli soldiers are saying that standing orders, they were on CNN, a group called themselves Breaking the Silence, and they're saying that standing orders were actually to shoot to kill. No civilians, no innocents, nothing. Anything that moves, if it's a male, shoot, and so on. Do you have any comment on that? I mean, Israeli soldiers went around collecting testimonies from, dozens and dozens of soldiers who were in combat.
Saeed, I've seen some of the reporting. We were very clear at the time that for calling on Israel, both sides, frankly, to show restraint, especially in targeting civilians.
Right.
The government of Israel has conducted its own review, and again, we stand by, in that conflict, what we've said publicly before in statements from the podium and elsewhere about the need to show that restraint regarding civilian populations. But as to these new allegations, I don't have anything to add.
It's been a year, yet the aid that was promised, a huge amount of aid last October was promised. None of it went in. The situation is really very desperate. Is the United States doing anything on its own to alleviate the suffering of the people of Gaza?
Sorry, when you speak of aid, are you talking?
I'm talking about the donor. The donors. They had a meeting in Cairo, including Secretary of State Kerry, who attended, and something like $4 billion were sort of pledged in aid to Gaza. That up to this point, none of it has gone in. I was wondering, while we wait for the donors to sort of fulfill their obligations, is the United States doing anything on its own to alleviate the suffering of the people of Gaza, such as perhaps pressuring Israel and Egypt to sort of open the entry points and exits and so on to Gaza?
Yeah, specifically as to the assistance, I don't have an update on that to share. We've long said that we recognize the humanitarian situation in Gaza. As we've spoken before, there are legitimate avenues to get assistance into the people of Gaza. Certainly, there are security considerations as well. It's something we've long recognized. It's something we discuss, obviously, with all the key players in the region. I don't know if we have a specific update on that pledge of assistance to Gaza, we recognize the situation and the need.
And finally, on Gaza,
Sure.
Last night I met with a Gazan whom you guys lifted out of there because he has 2 kids that are U.S. citizens. They were born in this country, so he was able to come on the 21st of July last year. But his wife, they only allow one of the parents. His wife had to remain behind, and since then she had a baby. What is the U.S. policy in this case? Would you bring in the other parent, or would you keep them, sort of trapped where she is?
So,
what is the policy in this case?
Again, without having all of the casework in front of me, and frankly, without having a consular affairs expert to adjudicate it, I can't really speak to these kinds of individual cases. And not to mention, there's privacy considerations here.
So, but you are aware that you can only one parent could leave, right?
I'm generally aware of some of the parameters that you talk about, but I can't specifically address that case. I'm just sorry, but I can't.
Thank you.
Sorry, Leslie, go ahead.
Which subject?
Yeah, sure.
I want to ask you for any comment on the Myanmar set an election date for November 8. Do you have any comment on that, and how do you see this vote going ahead?
Sure. Well, we welcome the announcement of an election date. We think that a credible parliamentary election will serve as an important step in Burma's democratic transition. The United States is providing some technical support to the Union Election Commission, as well as some of the political parties and civil society groups and stakeholders, other stakeholders, to ensure that they are able to conduct inclusive and transparent elections.
So the U.S. is an observer, or
Well,
just providing funding?
So we are providing funding and technical assistance. I do know that in terms of the observer status, members of the Carter Center and the European Union have been invited to monitor the general election process. Now, the Union Election Commission, said it will also allow other domestic and international election observers, but that process is still ongoing and identifying some of those folks.
Okay.
But we are, just to answer your question fully, we are providing election monitoring training, support to civil society organizations, and they'll provide or field upwards of 5,000 independent, nonpartisan electoral observers in the months leading up to the general election.
Thanks.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
US is observing that as well?
I just said we haven't, the answer is maybe, because the Union Election Commission is still vetting and deciding, but they've said that they will invite domestic and international observers. So far, the Carter Center, I think, has been invited, and the European Union have both been invited.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Another topic?
Yeah, no worries.
Cuba, any update on the opening of the embassy?
No, nothing to announce in terms of ribbon cutting. I mean, as we've said, just to delineate between that ribbon cutting ceremony at the embassy and the actual opening of the embassy, the exchange of letters that the two presidents shared last week, that did say that did stipulate that on July 20th the embassies will actually reopen. So as of July 20th, we will have a functioning embassy in Havana. But as far as the ribbon cutting and all that goes, nothing to announce.
Not yet.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure thing. The fight against ISIS. Sure. Wouldn't be a briefing without some discussion. No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I just wanted to follow up on some of the things that John suggested.
Yep.
He cited that when there is basically, implicitly, when there is a will to fight, such as the Peshmerga in the north fighting ISIS and the Kurdish fighters also in the north of Syria, fighting ISIS, then we can see the outcome on the ground that ISIS can't be pushed back. Is there implicit suggestion there that the Iraqi army is not fighting or will not fight?
Not at all. We've long said that some of these local fighters have been absolutely integral to combating ISIL. But everything we do is through the Iraqi military and the Iraqi government, and all the equipping and supplying that we do is conducted through them and with their concurrence. So, there's a recognition, I think, that, that this needs to be locally owned, if you will, that we need to really build the capacity of local forces, and that includes the Iraqi military itself, to be able to push back and combat ISIL.
Would that implicitly suggest that maybe you ought to give direct aid to the Peshmerga, direct heavy equipment? I mean, not just rifles and guns and so on, but things like tanks and other battlefield equipment, heavy duty that they can use?
Well, again, we have been providing some assistance to the Peshmerga, again, through the Iraqi government. We feel like that's getting into their hands expeditiously. We don't feel like there's a delay mechanism or anything. We feel like that the system currently is working pretty well in terms of getting them what they need. In terms of additional support, obviously we're always looking at that, but nothing to announce. Yeah, go ahead, Liz. Yeah, sure.
Talking about the
please.
embassy opening,
Yeah.
but I just want to go back to the detentions over
Yep.
the weekend and any discussions with the Cubans about this. I mean, I know that we saw, the comments yesterday by John and, and a couple of tweets, but in terms of, diplomatic outreach to the Cuban government about it, and, have you heard that they've been released? Any update you could provide?
I don't have a real update. We had seen reports that some of the, if not all of the activists had been released by the Cuban authorities. We did certainly raise it with the Cubans, and as you said, we spoke about it publicly, which we, will continue to do when we see these kinds of human rights violations.
Well, you only spoke about it because we asked about it. I mean,
That's not true. Roberta
Well,
Jacobson
I mean, a
tweeted
tweet-
about it over the weekend.
I understand,
I
but-
understand that it's not, or it's
I
a different
don't
forum
think-
for
right.
communicating, but it's still nevertheless a public one.
I'm just wondering the level of, it just seems as if there's an effort to kind of downplay this a bit because playing the long game in the hopes that, your outreach will eventually give you leverage with the Cubans. It doesn't sound like, a week after your announcement of restoring diplomatic ties, in many ways because of the hopes that political reforms would take place on the island, something like this happens. I mean,
Right.
is
Well-
this a backtrack?
I don't know that it's a backtrack, but it's certainly, it's not the progress we hope to see through the restoration of diplomatic relations. But we have been very clear why we're doing this and why we're seeking to re-engage with the Cuban government, because 54 years of isolation hasn't been doing us any good. And so we believe that through that engagement, engagement both with the Cuban people, but certainly with the Cuban government, we're going to be able to raise all of these issues on a consistent basis. They're not going away. We're not saying,
No, I understand, but you say that, 50 years of isolation didn't help, but at the first sign of, serious engagement, this happens. And I'm wondering, what's the message you take from this?
I would just say this is a process. I don't think any of us are under any illusions that this will be overnight. But we're going to continue to engage. We're not going to certainly not raise these issues. We've said, as I said all along, we believe that through engagement we can actually push a more positive agenda and get the Cuban government to change its ways.
I'm just coming back to that. You said it was raised with the Cubans. At what level?
I'm not sure. That's what I
Through the
was
mission?
checking. I'd have to check on that. Apologize. I don't have it in front of me. Anything else, guys?
Can I
Yeah, please,
ask
go ahead,
about
Lisa.
Africa? This week you named a new special envoy for the Great Lakes.
We did.
What exactly is his first? When's he planning to visit the region? Would Burundi be the first thing he'd try to tackle in that area, since it It looks as though it's one of the biggest.
Right, very good question. And I don't have, he just began or was appointed earlier this week, Thomas Perello. I mean, obviously, the Great Lakes encompasses, just for the other folks, I know you know this, Leslie, but the Great Lakes states of Burundi, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, and Uganda. Obviously, the situation in Burundi is of great concern, and one of our priorities, one of his priorities. I don't know of any plans to immediately travel there, but we can try to get an update for you.
Okay.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Greece.
Yeah, go ahead.
Could you tell us how and if the Grexit, the potential exit of Greece from the Eurozone, is impacting the Transatlantic Treaty, the negotiations, the terms, or any U.S.-related interests?
Sure. As we've said, and Leslie's heard us say all this week, certainly Secretary Liu, other senior Treasury and state officials, obviously Secretary Kerry in the White House, continue to stay in close touch with a broad array of counterparts on the situation in Greece. What you're speaking about more broadly about, the potential impact, of course, the stability and security of Greece, who is a NATO ally, as well as an EU partner, is important to the United States and the transatlantic community, which is why we continue to believe it's in the interest of all parties to get Greece back on a path whereby it can resume reforms, return to growth, and achieve debt sustainability within the Eurozone. So, that's it. Good, guys. Thank you so much.